People always ask me the same thing. They ask if I knew that morning that everything was about to change. And the honest answer is no, I didn't know anything. I knew the weight of my boots. I knew the cold coming up off the stone. I knew that the wind in Esfelt always smelled faintly of river water and wood smoke, even inside the palace walls. That's all I knew. A man doesn't get a warning before the floor falls out from under his life. It just falls. My name is Renner. For 31 years I served the crown of Esfelt as a king's guard, and for 19 of those years I stood my post in the east wing of Home Palace. If you've never stood a guard's post, let me tell you what it is. It is the art of becoming furniture. You learn to disappear while remaining fully present. You learn to see everything and react to nothing. Lords would walk past me discussing things that could topple governments, and they'd speak as freely as if I were a coat rack. That was the job. You hold still. You hold your tongue. You hold the line. I was good at it. I was proud of it even. My father had done the same work and his father before him, and I used to think the highest thing a man could be was reliable, steady, the kind of stone the river runs over and never moves. I'm telling you this so you understand what it cost me later to move. It was the second week of autumn. The leaves in the inner courtyard had started to turn that deep copper color, and they'd drift down and catch in the corners of the cloister where the wind couldn't reach them. There was a chill in the air that morning that hadn't been there the day before. The kind of cold that tells you summer is genuinely gone and isn't coming back, not for a long while. I remember the small things, because the big things came so fast afterward, that the small things are all I could hold on to. I remember the kitchen smoke. I remember a maid named Orla humming as she carried linens down the gallery. I remember that one of the great clocks in the long hall was running about 4 minutes slow, and I'd made a note to mention it, and I never did, because by that evening clocks were the last thing on anyone's mind. And I remember the little princess. Princess Adela was 8 years old that autumn. The youngest grandchild of the king, the only daughter of the crown prince. She was the sort of child who made the whole palace feel less like a museum and more like a home. She had this way of running through the galleries in her stocking feet, shoes in her hand, because she said the polished floors were too good for sliding to waste. She'd wave at me every single morning. Every morning. Even though guards aren't supposed to wave back, even though I never did, she waved at me like it was the most important diplomatic mission of her day. A small hand, lifted, fingers wiggling. "Hello, Sergeant Renner," as if I were a person and not a statue. I'm not ashamed to say I loved that child. Not the way you'd love your own, I didn't have that right, but the way a man loves the small good things he gets to stand near. She made the long hours mean something. On the dull gray days she was the bit of color. Her father, the Crown Prince Rowan, was the heir to Esfelt's throne, a serious man, tall, careful, the kind who weighed his words before he spent them. He'd lost his wife, the princess's mother, 3 years before, a fever that came on fast in the winter and took her in 9 days. I stood guard outside the chapel during the morning, and I watched a strong man learn how to be hollow. He came out the other side of it mostly. But there was a quiet in him after that, a kind of permanent dusk. He poured everything he had left into that little girl. She was his whole compass. Everyone in the palace knew it. And then there was the queen. Now I need to be careful here, because what I'm about to tell you is the part people get wrong when they retell it. They make her a monster from the first word. The truth is harder than that, and I think the truth is always harder than the story. Queen Sabine was the king's second wife. He'd married her some 6 years after his first queen passed, and the marriage had been, by all the polite accounts, a sensible one. She was elegant. She was sharp. She'd been a noblewoman of the western provinces, well-bred, well-read, the kind of woman who could command a room simply by walking into it and letting the room realize she'd arrived. She wore her authority like a coat she never took off. The court was divided about her, the way courts always are. Some thought she'd brought order and polish back to a household that had gone gray with grief. Others thought she was cold. I never had an opinion, not out loud. Opinions weren't my job. But I'll tell you what I noticed, because noticing was my job, and a guard who notices nothing is no guard at all. I noticed that Queen Sabine did not like the little princess. It's a strange thing to say about a grown woman and a child. It sounds petty, but I'd stood in those halls long enough to read a room the way a sailor reads the sky, and there was a weather between the two of them that never broke. The queen would smile at Adela in front of the king. She'd touch her shoulder, fix a stray hair, the whole performance of a loving step-grandmother. But the smile never reached her eyes, and when the king wasn't looking, the smile went away entirely, like a window that's only lit when someone's home. I think, and this is just an old guard's thinking, mind you, I think it was about the boy. See, the queen had a son of her own from before her marriage to the king. A young man, ambitious, the kind who measured every doorway to see if his shoulders would fit through it someday. And Princess Adela, little as she was, sat in a place that complicated certain ambitions. She was the crown prince's daughter. She was beloved. She was, in the slow arithmetic of royal succession and royal favor, a presence. And presences can be inconvenient to people who are counting on the room being emptier than it is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. On that autumn morning, none of that was anything but a feeling I had, a draft under a door, nothing you could name. What I could name was this. Around the middle of the morning, I was standing my post at the east end of the long gallery, the one that runs above the inner courtyard with the tall windows down one side. And the princess came past me, shoes in her hand, the way she did. But she didn't wave. That was the first thing, she didn't wave. She was walking fast, her head down, and she was holding her left arm a little funny, tucked in against her side, like you do when you've knocked your elbow and you're trying not to make a fuss about it. She went past me without a word, and I watched her go all the way down the gallery and turn the corner toward the children's wing. Now a guard doesn't react to that. A child has a bad morning, a child skips a wave. That's a thing that happens in the world. I told myself she'd had a scolding over her lessons. I told myself she was tired. I had a dozen reasons ready, because the mind is very good at having reasons ready when it doesn't want to look at something straight on. So I held my post, I held still, I held the line. But the cold thing had already settled in my chest, and it wouldn't leave. Maybe an hour later, the queen came down the same gallery. She moved the way she always moved, slow and certain, like the floor had been laid specifically so that she could walk on it. There were two of her ladies trailing behind her, and the three of them were talking in those low court voices that are pitched exactly so the servants can't catch the words. The queen's color was high. There was something flushed and tight about her face, and her jaw was set in a way I'd seen before on men about to lose their temper and determined not to. She passed within 3 feet of me, and as she passed, one of her ladies said something I did catch, just a fragment, because the woman didn't think to lower her voice in time. "She'll have a mark, Your Majesty. The nurse will see it." And the queen said, sharp and quiet, "Then the nurse will mind her own affairs, as everyone in this house should learn to do." And then they were past me, down the gallery, gone. I want to tell you I knew right then. I didn't. But the cold thing in my chest turned over slow, like something heavy rolling in dark water. A mark. The nurse will see it. She'll have a mark. I thought about the way the princess had held her arm. I held my post. You have to understand, and I've made my peace with this mostly, but it still sits in me. You have to understand that holding your post is not a small thing for a man like me. It was my whole life. It was my father's voice in my ear. It was 19 years of training that lived below my thinking, in my spine, in my hands. A guard does not investigate. A guard does not interpret. A guard does not insert himself into the private weather of the family he serves. The moment you start deciding which things you've seen are worth acting on, you've stopped being a guard and started being a problem. I'd watched men ruined for less. A guard who talks is a guard who's done. So I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I'd misheard. I told myself 100 things, standing there in the cold light from those tall windows, and not one of them quieted the thing in my chest. That night I didn't sleep well. I lay in my narrow room in the guards' quarters and I listened to the wind work at the old stone, and I thought about a small hand wiggling hello, and I thought about that same small arm held tight against a small side, and I thought, it's not your business, Renner. Hold the line. The next morning she waved at me. I have never been so glad of anything so small in all my life. She came down the gallery, shoes in her hand, and she lifted that little hand and wiggled the fingers, and the relief of it nearly buckled my knees. See, I told myself, you old fool, you imagine the worst because the worst is what your tired mind reaches for. Everything's fine. But as she passed, she turned her head just slightly, and I saw the side of her face in the morning light. There was a yellow-green shadow under her left cheekbone, the kind of color a bruise turns on its second or third day when it started to heal and gone from purple to that sick fatting green. Small, easy to miss, hidden almost by the way she'd let her hair fall forward. And the worst of it, the thing I still can't fully put into words, was that she'd hidden it on purpose. An 8-year-old child had thought to let her hair fall a certain way so the grown-ups wouldn't see. Children don't learn to hide like that on their own. They learn it. Someone teaches them, even if no one ever says a word out loud. They learn that being seen is dangerous, and so they learn to disappear. She'd learned the same trick I'd spent 19 years perfecting, how to be present and unseen at the same time. And she'd learned it at 8 years old. That was the morning something in me started to come loose. Not all at once. A man like me doesn't break in one go. But that was the morning the first stone moved, and once the first stone moves, the river finds it. I still didn't act. I want to be honest with you about that because the stories people tell make me out to be braver than I was, and I won't have it. I didn't march off to the Crown Prince. I didn't raise an alarm. I went back to my post and I stood there and I shook on the inside where no one could see, and I did nothing. For 2 more days, I did nothing. Because here is the thing no one tells you about being the man who sees. Seeing is the easy part. Seeing happens to you whether you want it or not. The hard part comes after, the part where you have to decide what kind of man you're going to be about the thing you've seen. And most of us, most of the time, decide to be the kind of man who saw nothing. It's safer. It's quieter. You get to keep your post and your pension and your father's good opinion in your head. I almost was that man. I came so close to being that man that it frightens me still. What changed, it wasn't bravery. I'll tell you exactly what it was because it matters and because I think you'll understand. It was the camera. Home Palace was an old building, but the king had been a modern sort, and some years back they'd put in a security system through the main wings. Cameras up in the high corners, discreet, the kind most people forget are even there. I knew where every one of them was because knowing was part of my job. And there was one in particular, mounted high in the corner of the small East Solarium, the sunny little room off the children's wing where the princess took her morning lessons. A quiet room. Glass on 2 sides. The sort of room people thought of as private precisely because no one ever went in it but a child and her tutor. People forget about cameras in private rooms. They forget so completely that the camera might as well not exist. They behave, in front of that little black eye in the high corner, exactly as they would behave with no one watching at all. I knew the man who ran the watch room, an old colleague, name of Davin, near to retirement himself, the kind of steady fellow I'd trusted my back to for 20 years. And on the 3rd evening, after the 3rd sleepless night, I went down to the watch room. I told myself I was just going to talk. I told myself I wasn't going to ask him to do anything I shouldn't. That was a lie too. By then I'd gotten very used to lying to myself. I'd had a lot of practice that week. Davin let me in and poured us each a cup of the bitter watchroom tea that's been stewing since the dawn shift, and we sat a while and talked about nothing, the way old guardsmen do. And then I said, careful as I could, Davin, the East Solarium, the footage from that camera. Does it keep? He looked at me a long moment over his cup. Davin wasn't a stupid man. He knew there was no idle reason for a guard to ask such a thing. It keeps a fortnight, he said slowly. Then it writes over itself. Why? And I sat there in that little room full of glowing screens, and I felt the whole shape of my life leaning over me like a wave that's decided to fall. Because I knew that if I asked him to pull that footage, I wasn't a guard anymore. I was crossing a line my father would never have crossed, the line that says you do not pry, you do not interpret, you do not insert yourself into the private weather of the family you serve. I'd be done. Whatever came after, I'd be done as the man I'd spent 31 years being. And I thought about a small hand wiggling hello. I thought about hair let to fall a certain way to hide a healing bruise. I thought about an 8-year-old who'd already learned to disappear. Pull it, I said. The last 3 days, pull it and let me see. Davin set down his cup very slowly. He didn't ask me again why. I think he'd already started to guess, and I think he was a good enough man to be afraid of his own guess. You sure, Renner? He said. It wasn't really a question. No, I said, but pull it anyway. And he turned to the screens, and his hands moved over the controls, and somewhere in the great machine, the days began to rewind. The light of those past mornings flickered up on the glass in front of us, the sunny little solarium, empty, then not empty, the figures moving backward through their hours. I'll tell you what we saw in that footage, but not yet, because what we saw is the thing that changed everything, and once you've seen it, you can't go back to the part of the story where you didn't know. I've lived in the after of it for a long time now. Let me leave you just for a moment longer on the safe side of it. Davin found the right day. He found the right hour. He set it to play forward at normal speed, and we both leaned in toward that little glowing window into a room where 2 people had believed completely that no one was watching. There, Davin said quietly, there she is. And there she was, small as anything, sitting at the lesson table in the morning sun, her copybook open in front of her, swinging her stocking feet because they didn't quite reach the floor. My little princess, alive and whole on the glass. Not yet hurt. Not yet. I've thought a great deal in the years since about what it does to a man to watch a thing happen that he cannot reach into and stop. Because that's what it was, watching that footage. The thing had already happened. It was days old. It was finished, sealed, past. And yet there I sat in the watch room, leaning toward the glass, and every part of me was screaming to do something, to put my hand out, to put my body between, and there was nothing to put it between. Only light on a screen. Only a memory of a morning that was already gone. You feel it in your hands first, I've found. The helplessness. Your hands go cold and they want a job they can't have. Davin had the footage playing forward at normal speed. The little east solarium, full of soft autumn sun. The princess at her lesson table, swinging her feet. There was no sound, the cameras didn't carry sound, and somehow that made it worse. To watch a thing happen in silence. The mind fills in what it can't hear, and what the mind fills in is always the worst of it. Her tutor came and went. The morning lesson, by the look of it, ran its ordinary course. The child bent over her copybook. She looked up at one point, out the glass, at something in the courtyard, a bird maybe, and she smiled at it. And I had to look away from the screen for a moment because the smile was so much like the wave she gave me every morning that it hurt to see. Then the tutor gathered the books and left. And the room was empty, just the child alone in the sun. For the space of a few minutes, she got up. She wandered to the window. She pressed her palm flat against the glass the way children do, and she stood there looking out, small and content, a girl in a sunbeam with nothing in the world to fear. And then the door opened, and the queen came in. Davin went very still beside me. I heard him set his cup down without a sound. I won't take you through it moment by moment. I've decided in telling this that I won't do that, and I'll tell you why. Because the people who weren't there have a hunger for the moment by moment. They want the worst of it, frame by frame, like it's a thing to be consumed. And I won't feed that. That child deserved better than to have her worst morning picked over like a meal. So I'll tell you what happened, and I'll tell you true, but I'll keep the dignity of it, because somebody in this story has to. The queen spoke to her. You could see it, the shape of words, the queen's mouth moving, her hand making a sharp little gesture. The child turned from the window, and whatever was said, the child's whole body changed. You've seen it, maybe, in a child who's being scolded, the way they get smaller, the way the shoulders come up and the chin comes down, the way they fold inward to make less of a target. Adela folded like that. She knew this. Her body knew this. That was the thing that broke me, watching it. Her body already knew what was coming, the way a body only knows a thing it has met before. The queen took her by the arm, the left arm, the same arm Adela had held tight against her side in the gallery. And then the queen struck her. Once across the face, hard enough that the child's head turned with it, hard enough that even on that silent, grainy footage, even days late, even helpless, I came half out of my chair with my hand reaching toward the screen like a fool, like I could catch a blow that had already landed and healed. Davin put a hand on my shoulder. "Renner," he said, "just my name, steady, the way you talk to a man at the edge of something." The child didn't cry out. That's the part. On the footage she didn't even cry, not the way you'd think. She put her own small hand up to her cheek and she stood there, and you could see her doing the thing, the terrible learned thing of holding it in, of not making a fuss, of being small and quiet and good so that it would be over sooner. 8 years old, and she'd already learned that the way to survive a storm is to make no noise inside it. The queen said a few more words. She straightened the child's collar. That detail has never left me, the straightening of the collar, the tidying up of the evidence, as if a neat collar could put right what the hand had done. And then she left, walked out of the sun-filled room as smooth and certain as she walked everywhere, and the door closed, and the child was alone again. And the little princess stood there in the empty solarium with her hand on her cheek. And then, only then, when she was sure she was alone, when she was sure no one in the whole world was watching, she let herself cry. Quietly, into her own hands. A small figure in a big, bright room, crying into her hands, believing herself completely unseen. Except she wasn't unseen. She was seen. There was a camera in the high corner that everyone had forgotten. And there was an old guard down in a watchroom days later with tears running into his beard, and not the first idea how to wipe them away, because his cold, useless hands were still half reaching for a screen. Davin reached over and stopped the playback. The frozen image sat there glowing in front of us. He didn't say anything for a long while. Neither did I. There are some things two old men sit with in silence, because words would only make them smaller. Finally Davin said, very low, "What are you going to do, Renner?" And there it was, the whole question of my life, laid out flat on the table between us like a drawn sword. Because I had crossed the first line just by asking to see. But this was the second line, and it was a far steeper one. What I'd seen was the kind of thing that, if I carried it out of that room, would not stop where I stopped it. It would run. It would run all the way up to the top of the house and shake the foundations. A king's second wife, a future king's daughter. You don't carry a thing like that to the crown prince and then go quietly back to your post. There is no quietly after. There's no holding the line. The line was already gone. I thought about every reason not to. I thought about my pension. I thought about my father's voice telling me a guard does not pry. I thought about the very real chance that I would not be believed, that an old guardsman accusing the queen would be the one packed off in disgrace, footage or no footage, because the powerful have a way of making inconvenient truths into the crimes of the people who carry them. I thought about Davin, who'd be ruined alongside me for having pulled it. I thought about all of it, every cost, and the costs were real. I want you to know they were real. I'm not pretending I was some hero who didn't count them. And then I thought about her hand on her cheek, and her crying into her hands because she thought no one could see. "I'm going to the crown prince," I said. Davin let out a long breath. He'd known, I think, before I did. Then you'll need this, he said, and he started doing something with the controls, copying the footage off onto one of those little devices they used, his old hands moving slow and sure. Because they'll say you're lying. They always say the man is lying. Give them something they can't unsay. They'll ruin you for this, Davin. I'm 63 years old, he said, and I've got a bad knee and a pension I'm sick of waiting for. Let them ruin me. He pressed the little device into my hand and closed my fingers around it. You go on now, before you talk yourself out of it. I know you, Renner. You'll talk yourself out of it if you stand here another minute. He was right, I would have. I went out of the watchroom with the device in my fist like it was a hot coal, and I walked the cold halls of Home Palace toward the Crown Prince's apartments, and I'll tell you, every step of that walk I felt the whole weight of 19 years on that post trying to pull me back. Hold the line. Hold the line. It's not your business. Go back. Go back to your post and forget you ever asked. You can still unknow this if you go back now. I did not go back. It was evening by then. The Crown Prince kept late hours, especially in those years. A man who didn't sleep well doesn't rush toward his bed. His private guards knew me, of course. I'd stood beside them at 100 functions. They were surprised to see me off my post and asking for an audience, and rightly so. A king's guard does not simply request to see the heir to the throne. It isn't done. It's a matter for His Highness, I said. Concerning the Princess Adela, I'll say it to no one but him. That got me through the door. The princess's name was a key in that house. Everyone knew what she was to him. They brought me into a study lined with books, a fire going low in the grate, the smell of old paper and wood smoke. And the Crown Prince Rowan stood up from his desk when I came in, and I saw the question on his face before he spoke it. Why is one of my father's guards in my study at this hour with that look on his face? Sergeant Renner, he said. He knew my name. Of course he did. He'd grown up in that house. I'd been furniture in it his whole life. What's happened? Is it Adela? Is she? She's well, Highness, I said quickly. She's sleeping. She's not in any danger tonight. And then, because there was no soft way, and a soft way would have been a cruelty, but I've come about a harm done to her, and I have proof of it. And I'm afraid that once I show you, neither of us can be the men we were an hour ago. He went very still, a careful man. He weighed me the way he weighed everything. And then he said quietly, "Show me." So I did. There was a screen in his study, the kind they used for correspondence and such. Davin had shown me how to make the device speak to it. My hands shook so badly it took me 3 tries. And then the little East Solarium came up on the glass, full of morning sun, and the child at the window with her palm against it, and the door opening and the Queen coming in. I stood beside the Crown Prince, and I watched his daughter's worst morning play across his face. I have stood guard through coronations and funerals. I have seen kings weep and lords rage and ladies faint dead away. In 31 years, I thought I'd seen every shape a strong feeling can take in a person. I had not seen this. He didn't move. That was the first terrible thing. He went completely, utterly still, the way the air goes still before the worst kind of storm, the kind that flattens whole forests. His hands, down at his sides, closed slowly into fists. His jaw worked once, and his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes never left the screen, not for 1 second, even when the blow came, even when the child folded, even when she put her hand to her cheek. He made himself watch all of it. He made himself watch his little girl get struck and not cry out and tidy her own collar and wait for it to be over. A lesser man would have looked away. He didn't have it in him to look away from his own child's pain. He took every second of it into himself like a man holding his hand in a fire on purpose. And when it ended, when she was alone in the room crying into her hands, I heard the breath go out of him, long and slow and shaking. "Play it again," he said. "Highness." "Play it again, Sergeant." I played it again, and I watched him watch it again, and somewhere in that second watching, the stillness broke. It didn't break the way you'd think. He didn't shout. Not then. The fury that came up in that man was the cold kind, the deep kind, the kind that doesn't waste itself on noise. When he finally turned to me, his face was white as ash and his voice was so quiet I had to lean in to catch it, and that quiet was more frightening than any roar I've ever heard. "How long," he said, "how long has this been happening in my house, to my daughter, under my roof, while I sat in this room reading my papers?" "I don't know, Highness. I saw the marks 3 days past. I asked for the footage tonight. This is all I have. But Highness..." And here I had to say the hard part, the part that had kept me up. A child doesn't learn to hide a bruise the way she's learned to hide it after only one time. She knew how to fall small. She knew to let her hair fall over it. That's not the first time. That's the first time I caught. I watched that land on him. I watched it go in like a blade. The not the first time of it. The under my roof while I read my papers of it. The thought of all the mornings he'd kissed his daughter good night and never known, never asked, never seen the small, careful way she'd been disappearing right in front of him. That was when the cold fury found its edge. He crossed the study in 3 strides and he caught up something off his desk, a heavy glass paperweight, I think it was, and for a moment I thought he'd throw it, and then he just set it down again, hard, his knuckles white around it, getting hold of himself by main force. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower still. "Where is she now, the Queen?" "Highness, I beg you." "Where is she?" "The West Apartments, I'd imagine, Highness, at this hour. But Highness, please." And I did a thing then that no guard should ever do. I put myself in his path. I stood between the Crown Prince of Esthelt and his own study door. "Please, hear an old man one moment. If you go to her now like this with the fury on you, they'll turn it. You know they will. They'll say you raised your hand to the Queen. They'll make you the villain of it. They'll bury what she did under what you did. The powerful always have that trick. You've got the truth and you've got the proof. Don't throw it away in one hot minute. Be colder than she is. For the child's sake, be the colder one." He stood there breathing hard, looking at me, this old guard who dared to block his door. And I watched the prince win the war with the father. It took everything he had. I could see it cost him more than any blow ever could. But he was a king's son, and a king's son knows that the worst rages must be the quietest, and he made himself nod. "You're right," he said. The words came out of him like they were torn. "God help me, you're right." He stepped back. He set both his hands flat on the desk and bowed his head over them and just breathed for a moment, getting himself back under his own command. "But understand me, Sergeant Renner." He lifted his head, and there was something in his face that I'd never seen and hope never to see again. A soft man's love turned all the way to iron. "She will answer for this." In the morning, before my father and the whole court, with this footage played for every eye to see. She struck my daughter in the dark where she thought no one would ever know. So I'll do it in the light. I'll do it where everyone knows. Let her find out what it is to be seen. And then he looked at me, really looked at me, the way the great ones almost never look at the furniture, and his voice changed entirely. All the iron went out of it. What was left was just a tired, grieving, grateful man. "You could have said nothing," he said. "It would have been easier for you to say nothing. Why didn't you?" And I told him the truth, the only truth I had. "Because she waves at me every morning, Highness," I said. "Every morning, even though I'm not supposed to wave back. And the morning she didn't wave, I knew something was wrong, and I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that for 3 days, and I'll carry those 3 days to my grave." My voice broke then, I'm not ashamed to say it. I couldn't make it 4, Highness. I just couldn't make it 4. The Crown Prince Rowan, heir to the throne of Esthelt, looked at this weeping old guardsman in his study at midnight. And he did a thing then that I have never told anyone, that I'll only tell you now because I'm old and it doesn't matter anymore who knows. He crossed the room and he took my hand and he shook it, firmly. The way you'd shake the hand of an equal, the way you'd shake the hand of a man you owed something to that could never be repaid. "Then we'll carry those 3 days together," he said, "and tomorrow we'll make sure there isn't a 4th, not for her, not ever again." He let go of my hand. He straightened. The prince came back over the father like a tide coming in, and his voice turned to business, to planning, to the cold, careful machine of a man who decided exactly what he was going to do and was no longer going to waste a single breath on feeling until it was done. "Go back to your post, Sergeant," he said. "Say nothing to anyone. Let her sleep tonight thinking she's safe. Let her have one more night of thinking no one saw." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was far colder than any frown. "In the morning, the whole world is going to see." I went back to my post. I stood the rest of that watch in the cold and the dark, and for the first time in 3 days, the thing in my chest had gone quiet. Not because it was over. It was a long way from over. But because I'd finally stopped holding the line, and I'd found out that the line had never been the thing worth holding. The child was the thing worth holding. I should have known that from the first morning she waved. I didn't sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of not sleeping. The 3 nights before, I'd lain awake with the thing eating at me. That night I lay awake the way a man does before a battle he's already decided to fight. Quiet, clear, almost peaceful in a strange way. The hardest part was behind me. I'd said the thing out loud. Now all that was left was to stand and watch it land. And standing and watching was the one thing in this world I knew how to do. The morning came up gray and cold over Esthel. I remember the bells. The palace had its bells that rang the hours, and that morning they sounded different to me, though of course they sounded exactly the same as every other morning. It's only that I was different. When a man changes, the whole world seems to change to match him, even when it hasn't moved at all. The Crown Prince had sent word quietly through channels I never saw, and by mid-morning the court had been called to assemble in the great receiving hall. Nobody knew why. That was the talk in the corridors, the lords and ladies drifting in, murmuring to one another, "Why has His Highness called us? Is it news from the western provinces? Is the old king unwell?" The not knowing made them nervous. You could smell it on the room, that particular sharp scent a crowd gives off when it senses something coming and can't name it. I was there. The Crown Prince had asked for me to be there, not as a witness to speak, not yet, but simply to stand my post against the wall where I always stood, so that when the moment came, I'd be in the room. I think he wanted me to see it through. I think he understood that a man who's carried a thing that far has earned the right to watch it set down. So I stood against the wall, furniture again, the way I'd been my whole life. But I wasn't furniture anymore, not really, and the not being furniture anymore was a strange new weight to carry. I stood very straight. I held my post one last time. The old king came in first and took his seat on the high chair. He was a frail man by then, thin as a winter branch, but his eyes were still sharp. And I watched him take in the assembled court and frown, because no one had told him the why of it either. His own son had kept it from him. That tells you something about how careful Rowan had decided to be. He wanted the truth to land on everyone at once, all in the same moment, with no one having had the chance to prepare a defense or smooth a story or quiet it away in a private room. "The light," he'd said. "I'll do it in the light." Then the Queen came in. She came in the way she came in everywhere, slow, certain, magnificent. She wore deep blue that morning, I remember, and she dressed for an occasion she didn't understand, which is its own kind of terrible thing to watch in hindsight. She took her place near the king. She had no idea. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She walked into that hall with her chin high and her ladies behind her, and she had no earthly idea that her whole life was about to end in that room in front of everyone in the light. She'd straightened a child's collar to hide what she'd done, and now her own collar was straight, and her own hair was perfect, and none of it was going to save her, because there was a camera in a high corner she'd forgotten, and an old guard who couldn't make it 4 days. The Crown Prince came in last. He dressed plainly, no ceremony to it, and his face was the face I'd seen the night before, that white still mask over the cold, deep fury, but held now, controlled, every inch of it under his command. He walked to the center of the hall and he turned to face his father and the court, and the room went quiet the way a room does when it finally realizes the thing it's been dreading has arrived. "I've called you here," he said, and his quiet voice carried to every corner of that hall because the silence was so complete, because a crime has been committed in this house, against a child, against my child, and I will not have it dealt with in whispers and back rooms the way this house deals with everything. It will be dealt with here, in front of all of you, in the light. I watched the Queen's face. The first flicker of something crossed it then. Not fear yet, she was too certain of herself for fear, not yet, but the first small crack of unease. She glanced toward the king. The king was frowning, leaning forward in his chair. "Rowan," the old king said, "what is this?" "Watch, father," the crown prince said. "All of you, watch." And they'd set up the screen. I won't describe the footage playing again. You've already seen it in your mind from when I told it before, and once is enough for any decent person. I'll tell you instead about the room, because I wasn't watching the screen that time. I'd seen it. I watched the room instead. I watched the faces. I watched a hall full of powerful people, lords who'd bowed to the Queen, ladies who'd flattered her, courtiers who'd built whole little careers on her favor. I watched all of them turn slowly to stone as they understood what they were seeing. The sun-filled solarium, the child at the window, the door opening, and the Queen, their queen, the woman half of them had been currying favor with not an hour before, crossing that bright room and taking a small girl by the arm and striking her across the face. There was a sound that went through the crowd. I don't know how to describe it. Not a gasp, exactly. Lower than that. A kind of collective intake, a sound a room makes when it stops believing one thing and starts believing another, all at once, all together. The sound of 100 people rearranging the entire world in their heads in the space of a single breath. And the child crying into her hands, alone, believing no one saw. The hall was silent when it ended. So silent I could hear the fire in the great grate and the small wind at the high windows. The old king had risen halfway out of his chair. His face, I've never seen an old man's face do what his did. He looked at the dark screen and then he turned, slowly, terribly, and he looked at his wife. And the Queen. Here is the thing I've thought about most in all the years since. The Queen did not break down. She did not weep or beg or fall to her knees. I'd half expected it and it didn't come. What she did was worse somehow, and it told me everything about her in a single moment. She drew herself up. She lifted her chin even higher. And she said into that silent hall, in a voice gone cold and hard as the stone underfoot, "The child is willful. She needed correcting. You all coddle her into a little tyrant, and not one of you has the spine to. That is enough." It was the old king who said it. And though his voice was thin and old, there was a thing under it that I'd forgotten was there, the thing that had made him king in the first place, and it cut her off as clean as an axe. The whole hall flinched. "You struck a child," the old king said, "a grieving, motherless child in my house, and called it correction." He sank back into his chair like the strength had gone out of his legs. He suddenly looked 100 years old. "I married you," he said, more to himself than to her, "and I let you into the rooms where my grandchildren sleep. God forgive me. God forgive me for what I did not see." And there it was again. The thing that had been haunting all of us. What I did not see. The king hadn't seen it. The crown prince hadn't seen it. A whole palace full of people whose entire profession was watching. None of us had seen it. Only a camera in a high corner. Only an old guard who almost didn't say. The Queen looked around the hall then, and I watched her understand finally that there was no one in it for her. The lords who'd bowed, the ladies who'd flattered, every one of them had turned to stone, and the stone was not on her side. Her son wasn't even in the room, he'd been kept away, I learned later, on the crown prince's careful instruction, so that nothing could become a brawl between heirs. She stood entirely alone in the center of all those people, in her deep blue, with her perfect hair, and she had nothing left to draw herself up against. I almost felt it then, the thing you're not supposed to feel for a person like her, almost. And then I remembered a small hand on a small cheek, and the feeling passed. What happened to her in the end was quiet. which I think galled her more than any loud punishment could have. There was no trial in the public squares, no spectacle. The old king would not shame the crown that far. But she was put aside, removed from the palace before nightfall, sent to a distant estate in the western provinces she'd come from, stripped of her place and her power and her access to those rooms forever. The marriage was quietly ended by such means as kings have for such things. Her name, which had filled the court's mouths for years, simply stopped being spoken. Within a season, it was as though she'd never walked those halls at all. The light had done what the dark could not. She'd spent her whole life being seen as magnificent, and in the end she was seen as exactly what she was, and being seen was the thing that finished her. But I don't want to end on her. She's had enough of this story. Let me tell you about the child. The crown prince took his daughter away from home palace for a long while after that, to a quieter house by the sea where she could be a child again without the weight of all those eyes. I didn't see her for the better part of a year, and I won't pretend that didn't grieve me. I'd gotten used to that morning wave. The galleries were colder without it. But she came back in time. Children are more durable than we deserve. They heal in ways grown people have forgotten how to. And the day she came back to home palace, I was at my post in the East Gallery, standing where I'd always stood, doing the only thing I've ever truly known how to do. And she came down the gallery, taller, a year older, shoes in her hand because the floors were still too good for sliding to waist. And she stopped in front of me. She'd never done that before. In all the years, she'd only ever waved on her way past. She looked up at me, this small girl who'd learned too young how to disappear, and who was learning now slowly that she didn't have to anymore. And she said, "And a guard isn't supposed to be spoken to, and a guard certainly isn't supposed to answer. And I'll tell you I didn't care one bit about either of those rules anymore," she said. "My father told me what you did, that you were the one who saw." I didn't trust my voice. I nodded. "He said you almost didn't tell." She studied me with those clear child's eyes that see right down to the bottom of a person. "But you did tell." "I did," I managed. And she reached up. She had to reach up. I'm a tall man and she was a small girl. She reached up and she put her small hand against the back of my old rough hand where it rested on my belt, just for a moment, just the lightest touch. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "Thank you for seeing me. I have stood guard through coronations and funerals and the rise and fall of a queen. I've been thanked by kings, and nothing in 31 years ever undid me the way those 4 words did, spoken by a child in a cold gallery, her hand on my hand. Thank you for seeing me." Because that, I understood then, was the whole of it. That was the thing under everything. She hadn't needed me to be brave or noble or to risk my post and my name and my father's good opinion. She just needed someone, anyone, to see her, to not look away, to not decide that her small, quiet suffering wasn't their business. All those mornings she'd waved at the man who wasn't allowed to wave back. She'd been doing the same thing the whole time, hadn't she? "Hello, I'm here. Please see me." And for 3 days I almost hadn't. I stayed at my post another few years, and then my knees gave out the way old guards' knees do, and they pensionied me off with a small ceremony and a kind word, and I went to live quiet in a cottage not far from the sea, not so far, as it happens, from where a certain young princess sometimes summered. She writes to me, even now. Did you know that? A grown woman now, with children of her own, and she still writes to the old guard who saw her. Every letter ends the same way, the same 4 words. And every time I read them I'm back in that cold gallery with her small hand on mine, and I thank whatever's up there that I couldn't make it 4 days, that the thing in my chest wouldn't let me, that for once in a long, careful life of holding still and holding my tongue and holding the line, I moved. People still ask me sometimes if I knew that morning that everything was going to change, and I still tell them no. A man doesn't get a warning, the floor just falls. But I've learned this in the long, quiet years since, and it's the only wisdom I've got, so I'll give it to you for nothing. We spend our whole lives learning how not to see, how to mind our own affairs, How to keep our heads down and hold our posts and tell ourselves the suffering across the room belongs to someone else. We get so good at it. I was the best there ever was. And it isn't strength that not seeing. I thought it was for 31 years. It isn't. The strength is in the other thing. The strength is in the small, terrible decision to look straight at the thing you'd rather not see and to say out loud where it costs you, I saw that. And it was wrong. And I won't pretend I didn't. A camera in a high corner can see anything. That's no great thing. Glass and wire it sees because it cannot help but see. But a man chooses. That's the whole difference. A man gets to choose to see. I chose late. I'll carry the lateness with me to the end. But I chose. And a little girl is grown and well and safe and writing letters by the sea. Because one cold morning, an old man who'd spent his whole life being furniture finally decided to be a witness instead. Thank you for seeing me, she wrote in the last one. No, child. Thank you for waving at the statue every morning until the statue remembered it was a man.